In the jungle, the scariest thing isn't the animals or the poisonous plants, even though there are plenty of both, but how quickly you become invisible because all it takes is turning the wrong way once, and the world around you keeps going as if you never existed, and your tracks get washed away by rain within an hour, then swallowed by mud the next day. In early 1981, Yossi Ghinsberg, a young traveller who hadn't yet grown disillusioned with the romance of big maps and blank spaces, found himself in Bolivia with that inner hunger familiar to anyone who has ever dreamed of walking into a place with no people, to see what would be left of them if comfort, schedules, and the usual handrails of civilization were stripped away. He didn't set out to die, of course, but he did want to feel a raw, real kind of life where every action actually matters. That's why he easily bought into the idea of a real Amazon, not the tourist version, and not the kind you see in pretty photos, but one that is wet, heavy, sticky, where every step costs effort, and where the silence can sometimes feel louder than any city. There were other people with him, and as it would later become clear, that was the first paradox of survival. When you move as a group, you feel safe, but the group is often what creates the mistakes, because inside it there's confidence, arguments, resentment, fatigue, the urge to prove you're right, and the fear of looking weak. The first day still felt like a normal adventure, where fear is almost pleasant because it feels manageable, and risk seems like part of a story you'll tell your friends later, where the hardest decisions aren't how to stay alive, but which way to turn and who to trust. The weather shifted as if someone were turning a dial. First the heat pressing down, then sudden downpours that turned everything into one wet, heavy layer, and conversations grew shorter because strength was being spent on steps and breathing. And it's exactly at this point, when people still have energy to walk, but no longer have energy to tolerate each other, that the first crack usually appears. Someone starts doubting the route, someone snaps, someone demands logic, and someone else digs in with "we agreed." Back then, Yossi didn't yet know that the most dangerous phrase in stories like this doesn't sound like a cry for help or an admission of being lost, but like calm confidence. It's fine. We'll get out soon, because it's right after those words that people take one more step forward, which later turns out to be the step past the line they don't come back from as the same person. At some point, they landed on an idea that sounds logical on paper, but in real life often turns into a trap. If you're not sure where you are, stick to the water, because a river feels like a road, and a road feels like rescue. A river doesn't require you to cut a path or guess a direction. It flows on its own, and it's easy to build the illusion in your head that if you just keep floating, you'll inevitably reach people, a village, civilization, because that's how stories and movies work, where water always carries you to an ending. Right here, the first real breaking point is born, because to travel by river, they had to trust not only the current, but their own hands, and also believe that improvisation would save them where a map had already become meaningless. They began building a raft, and the sheer fact that grown men in soaked clothes, in the middle of endless green, were hauling logs and tying them into a single structure can look almost heroic. But in scenes like this, what's usually hidden isn't heroism, but unrecognized desperation, so it still reads like a rational plan. The raft came out heavy, too rigid for a river that has no obligation to be smooth, and while it was still holding together, they felt that dangerous surge that often comes before disaster, the sense that they'd made it, that the hardest part was behind them because they were moving fast again, and the brain treats speed as proof of control. But in the jungle, speed is almost always paid for with a mistake, and the river that first feels like an ally eventually shows it has its own will, and that its road isn't your road. After that, everything happens very quickly, but long tragedies are built out of quick moments. The water strengthens, the current sharpens, the raft starts carrying them, not where they want to go, but where it wants to take them, and for the first time, they realize their plan of just float missed the main thing. A river has rapids, bends, log jams, and places where any structure thrown together in a hurry turns into a fragile board that simply can't withstand reality. At some point, they decide to split up, because splitting up almost always feels like a compromise. Less arguing, easier movement. You can separate and meet again. And in your head, it looks like reasonable optimization. But in real survival, splitting up is a wager where the price of error becomes maximal, because once you separate, you no longer have someone else's eyes, someone else's hands, and someone else's voice that might stop you when you're already heading the wrong way. Yossi still tries to hold on to logic, because logic is the last thing left to someone who's afraid to admit he's already losing control. But right at this moment, the story takes its turn. The river doesn't just carry them forward, it starts tearing them into different lines, and when the raft breaks and the distance between them grows large, Yossi feels for the first time what will haunt him for weeks, the silence where there is no answer from anyone else. After they split up, Yossi understood pretty quickly that everything feels different when you're alone, because even simple things that seemed minor in a group meeting someone's eyes, confirming a direction, or just hearing another person breathe nearby, suddenly turn into support, and without it, the mind starts running at full strain, trying to walk, think, control fear, and keep itself steady with words that sound strange in the empty air. For the first few hours he kept moving on inertia, trying to reason calmly and practically, because it seemed to him that if he kept order in his head, order in his actions would hold by itself. So he chose directions by the most obvious signs, kept listening for water, watched for where the forest looked lighter, and kept telling himself he would reach the river soon, and that the river would lead him to people, because that's how it should work logically. But the jungle breaks that confidence fast, because there are almost no fixed points you can memorize as landmarks. Everything repeats, the green wall blocks the horizon, and the sound of water appears and disappears. So after a couple of hours, he could no longer say for sure whether he was moving toward the river or just circling the same area, shifting slightly each time. And that uncertainty slowly built fatigue that first felt ordinary and then began to press down hard. He moved through thick growth, constantly catching on branches and vines, and he spent far too much energy on what looks like simple walking from the outside, but in reality turns into a fight for every meter because the ground is slick, his feet sink, his boots get soaked, and the worst part is that he doesn't notice the moment he starts saving movements and cutting corners, not because it's smart, but because he's running out of strength. By evening, it was clear he needed a place where he could stop at least for a short time, so he began looking for any small rise, because the low ground is wet and full of insects. He settled as best he could, but there was almost no sleep, because night in the jungle is nothing like the quiet a city person is used to. Everything moves and makes noise, and when you're alone, the brain automatically tries to classify every new sound, and that only deepens the exhaustion. The next day he kept going, but without yesterday's confidence, because it became obvious how quickly energy disappears and how strangely time works when you're constantly wet and hungry, with hours dragging slowly while strength vanishes fast. He tried to stay near water, but water in the jungle is deceptive too, because streams can bend away and swamps can look like a river until you get close and realize it's standing mud that can trap you. By the end of the second day, he began to feel irritation, and after irritation came anxiety, because irritation in stories like this usually means one thing. The person realizes there is no simple solution and tries to compensate with anger just to feel some kind of force again. He still hoped he would soon meet people, or at least see signs, but the farther he went, the fewer hints there were that anyone ever passes through these places. The hardest part wasn't that he didn't know the way, but that he gradually stopped understanding how far he had already gone and in which direction, because when everything around you is the same trees and the same humidity, memory clings only to scattered sensations, and at some point he caught himself thinking that even if he turned back right now, he wouldn't be able to return to the point where he had still felt sure everything was under control. By the third day, Yossi was moving noticeably slower, because his body began reacting to constant dampness and lack of food the way it always does. First comes shivering and weakness, then irritability, and after that, a kind of fatigue, where even a simple action, stepping over a root or climbing a small rise, requires a pause and a conscious push. He kept trying to hold the direction he believed was right, but the real problem was that the jungle doesn't let you confirm that a direction even exists because the horizon is sealed off. There are no trails, and any marks in the mud vanish after the first rain. He tried to walk along water because water at least gives a line, but the line kept breaking. A stream would bend away, turn into a chain of puddles, then gather again into a flow, and each time he had to decide whether to detour through thick brush or climb straight into the stream bed where everything is slick, and one slip can cost a lot. During one of those crossings he injured his leg, and that was a bad sign because any injury in the jungle immediately means two things. Your speed drops and the risk of infection rises, while there are no clean conditions, no dry clothing, and the body is already weakened. After that came days that are hard to separate into distinct events because they blended into one long stretch of walking, stopping, and trying to find something to eat. He tried collecting what seemed safe, and he tried catching small prey, but in that state almost everything went badly. His hands trembled, he didn't have the strength, and mistakes in the forest are expensive, so he kept being forced back to the simplest goal: find anything that gives energy and lets him keep moving. Nights became harder because sleep was shallow and broken, and his body didn't recover. The dampness kept rubbing his skin raw, small cuts didn't heal, and he caught himself more and more often having to stop his own thoughts because they began spinning in circles. At some point, a dangerous habit appeared, putting decisions off because every decision required effort, and there was almost no effort left, and that gradually made his movement chaotic, where he seemed to be walking, but in reality he was only trying not to stand still. With each day he depended more and more on the river because the river was the only clear structure in that green mess, so he returned to water again and again, even when it meant taking a difficult bank and risking a fall, and that slowly mattered because water, strangely enough, still offered a chance to reach people if he didn't collapse first. By the middle of this period, he was no longer counting days accurately because the count slipped and his sense of time broke down, so he began tracking simple signs instead. Was it getting worse? Could he cover more or less distance? Could he find food? Did he still have the ability to stand up without a long pause? He understood that in this condition, the main thing was not to speed up because speeding up burns the last of your strength, and at the same time he couldn't stop completely because stopping meant the jungle would start wearing him down even faster, first through a cold night, then through weakness, then through the moment when he simply couldn't get back up. One day, as he walked along the bank and tried not to lose sight of the water, he noticed signs that people did in fact come here sometimes, and that moment became a point after which he had a concrete goal: reach a place where he wouldn't just be surviving, but would meet a human being. When Yossi first saw signs that people came through nearby, he gained a goal that was different from the earlier blur, because before he was simply trying to get out of the forest, and now he was trying to reach a specific sign of life, holding one thought in his head: if people walk here, then somewhere close there is a trail, a camp, or at least a place where he can wait for help. He stayed with the river because the river remained the only landmark that didn't vanish after rain, and he moved along the bank in bursts, stopping for a few minutes, then forcing himself to walk again until his strength ran out. By then, his body was running on what was left, so even small tasks, crossing a tangle of fallen wood or climbing down to the water, took far longer than they had in the first days, and because of that, he was constantly at risk of losing his pace, and with his pace losing the ability to change anything at all. At one point, he reached a stretch where the bank looked different, and it felt like a person had been here, not necessarily often, but enough that the surroundings were slightly disturbed, and that gave him a chance, because he then noticed a shelter that could mean only one thing: someone lived nearby, which meant help was possible if he could reach it, and if he was seen. He could no longer count on being able to explain for long, ask, or prove anything, because his voice was weak and his movements were slow, so everything narrowed to something simple: get to people and show that he wasn't a threat and that he needed help. When they saw him, it became clear that this wasn't last-second luck in a movie sense, but a chain of decisions that still depended on chance. He stayed with the water, he didn't go deep into the forest, he didn't lose himself completely, and he reached an area where people could actually meet him. The pace of the story changes sharply after that, because solo survival always drags slowly and rescue happens fast. They fed him what they had, let him come to his senses, and then helped him get to a safer place from which it was possible to contact those who were searching. After that came the usual things in cases like this: recovery, treatment, and trying to understand how he had managed to stay alive. Later, it became known that they weren't simply waiting, but were truly searching for him, and that the people who had been with him at the beginning had also gone through hard decisions and dangerous moments while trying to find a way back without losing hope. And although the ending for Yossi was a happy one, the story doesn't feel like a clean victory, because over those weeks he paid a very concrete price. His body was exhausted, wounds and infections needed treatment, and his mind held on for a long time to the feeling that any wrong step could have ended everything much earlier. If you reduce this story to one conclusion, without pretty words and without extra philosophy, he survived because he didn't stop moving, because he stayed with the river as the only constant landmark, because he didn't go deep into the thick jungle where the chance of meeting a person is almost zero, and because he was lucky enough to reach a zone where people were actually nearby when he had almost no strength left.